Next, the protests in Peru's capital. People converging on Lima from across the country. Supporters of the ousted leader Pedro Castillo are calling for the current administration to resign and for fresh elections to be held. There's been 5 weeks of ongoing protest, and at least 42 people have been killed. Dan Collyns, our correspondent, joins us now live from Lima. Dan, good evening to you. What's the latest you can tell us?
Well, as you mentioned, Mark, people are converging on Lima. There is a nationwide protest expected for Thursday. That will take place, as I mentioned, across the country, but also particularly in the capital, Lima. And as we understand it, we're hearing reports now of people coming from, for example, under Huaylas, which is in the southern Andes, which was the first town to be affected by the deadly violence in December, with several people killed by the security forces there. And also people coming from the north, where there have been roadblocks in the northern trunk road that goes north of Lima. And so there's also a growing kind of paralyzation of the country with roadblocks and blockades and the declaration of a national strike. And so it does seem that pressure is increasing, and what people are seeking is the resignation of Dina Boluarte and her cabinet. The demands of the protests have morphed, and they have been amplified by the number of deaths. Not so much that people are less demanding the release of Pedro Castillo, and more it is you're seeing people who never supported Pedro Castillo coming out to demand the resignation of the current president.
President Boluarte, you mentioned her, you mentioned the pressure that she's been under. Tell us how she's reacting. What are the implications of what she's been doing?
What the protesters are the main complaint is that the government and her cabinet, they say, has the political responsibility for the deaths, and they have, as you mentioned, more than 40 deaths, almost all the civilians, with one police officer. And now we're seeing the post-mortem reports coming from those what took place, and we're seeing that gunshot wounds were the causes of most of those deaths. Boluarte on Friday, in a late-night televised address, said that she would not step down, but she also apologized for the deaths. She's also under pressure to bring forward elections and to close Congress. She said that she could not constitutionally close the Congress, which is hugely unpopular in Peru, and it's in fact in Congress's hands now to bring forward elections, which is a central demand of the process. In March, they're expected to make a second vote, which will finalize bringing forward elections by 2 years to 2024. But even that is not satisfying the protesters. And many political analysts here are saying that they will have to look for other solutions and see if they can actually bring them forward for the elections to later this year, because they don't believe that Boluarte's government is sustainable. They can actually last another year with her in office.
And Dan, the reaction to the violence of the past 5 weeks, and of course more than 40 people, as I understand, predominantly protesters, have been killed. The international reaction to this has actually been quite alarming, alarm worldwide about what's been happening.
Indeed, there has been alarm, and we've had the embassies in Lima of many nations, including France and the UK, expressing deep concern about what's taking place in Peru. Also, the United Nations, and where there's been recently been a visit of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is a regional organization in Latin America. They have been looking closely at what they say has been evidence of the disproportionate use of force and the use of lethal and high-caliber weapons against protesters. And the main, I think, the concern has been the proportionality of the response of the security forces faced with protesters, who the security forces say have been using homemade weapons, including explosives. But at the same time, there's been evidence that the use of live ammunition by the security forces, and also throwing, for example, tear gas canisters from helicopters. And there has been, I think, deep concern about this at an international level, and a lack of decent explanation, I think, on the part of the Dina Boluarte's cabinet, particularly the defense and interior ministers, to try and justify what that's being seen as a disproportionate use of force.
It almost seems like a very strong paramilitary response to it, Dan, doesn't it? The evidence stacking up, of course. And to come back to where we started about the latest issues as they are right now, with so many people heading towards the capital, I imagine there is a real atmosphere of great tension there now.
There is an atmosphere of tension. It's calm at the moment. There have been protests on over the weekend and also on Thursday of last week. Now that they didn't become violent, those protests. There was some scuffles, but nothing like on the scale of what we've seen in the south of Peru. I would say, though, I think it's important for the government to make sure that there isn't violence in the protests, which are likely to take place this week. I think if there's any increase in the death toll, then the demands for Dina Boluarte to resign will only increase, and I think that they will only strengthen the protests and what looks like a national strike taking place as well, which could easily paralyse the country again, as we saw in December.
Dan Collyns in Lima, thank you very much indeed. Dan, watching all developments for us, of course, on that situation in Peru. More protests expected. Dan will be across all developments for us. Thanks, Dan.